Hello there and welcome to the Secrets of Organ Playing podcast. I'm your host, Vidas Pinkevičius. Welcome to Secrets of Organ Playing podcast number 119. Today is Sunday, November the 5th, 2017, and today's guest is Nicholas Papadimitriou, an organist, pianist, and composer from Greece. But now he is living in the Netherlands because now he is the organist at the Pelgrimskerk in Bad Hoeverdorp. In this conversation, you will find out a lot of his musical journey stories, how he first started learning music, piano, and even organ back home in Greece, and how he wasn't satisfied with this, and he looked for further ideas in Europe, especially in Amsterdam, and that's where he met the famous Jacques van Noordmersen, Peter van Dyck, and Matthias Havinga, who made a wonderful impact on him as a musician. But he was not satisfied with this even further, because he started improvising and even composing. So in this conversation, you will find out a lot of his approaches with improvisation and composition, and I hope you will stick to the very end of this conversation, because I will ask him this question: what are 3 steps in order to become a better organist? And Nicholas replied with very wise some ideas. I hope you will feel inspired by his generous approach, and also start improvising and composing just like he did, and experimenting with musical ideas. So let's go to the show and let's find out more about Nicholas Papadimitriou. Thank you so much, Nicholas, for joining this conversation. I'm really delighted that we can really connect. You are the first organist from Greece, actually, that I have personally met and talked, and now we're recording a conversation. So our range of countries and nationalities of guests are expanding, and I'm very curious to know more about Greek organ culture and maybe your own experience back home, right? So I know you are living in the Netherlands now, but of course, you know plenty of stuff that interests organists back home too. So thank you so much. You are very generous with your ideas and time, and welcome to the show.
Well, nice to be here. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Where shall I start?
Let's start from the beginning, Nicholas. I'm very curious to know what were your beginnings with organ. How did you first fell in love with this instrument?
Well, it's quite an interesting story, because in Greece in general, there are not so many organs. Mm-hmm. So one could say there isn't really an organ tradition. So it's indeed rather rare for somebody to come across that instrument in general. In general, we had a piano at home. So since I was a little kid, I always liked to play around. So let's say there was a bit of a musical culture in my family. And I think the first time I had seen an organ was around when I was 6 years old. And at the time, they were inaugurating the concert hall in Athens. Oh. And that concert hall had a new organ by Kleis. And at the time, they had Nicholas Papadimitriou from England giving a few concerts there. So that's the first time I actually saw one and heard one, and I was instantly captivated by it. And from that moment, something told me I wanted to do something with that instrument. I wanted to know more. And it is an interesting story, because in Greece, since there aren't so many organs, there are also not many organ teachers. So for a while, in the beginning, I started with piano playing around that time. And I continued always knowing in the back of my head that eventually I also want to play organ. So later at some moment, and due to a coincidence, my mother got to know one of the organists of the concert hall. Uh-huh. And we got introduced to each other, and that's when I started having lessons. So I was already, let's say, relatively far with piano playing, and then I finally got to start playing organ.
You were about 15 years old, right, when you
Yes, that's
started
true.
playing organ. So at that age, probably you knew a lot about the musical ideas, right? What captivated your attention with this instrument first?
With these instruments, yeah, it's even though I hadn't been playing organ before I was 15, I was quite into trying to listening a lot of organ repertoire, looking at the capabilities of the instruments, listening to different recordings. So I got to know a bit the concept behind it. And a lot of things fascinated me about it, actually, both from a, let's say, scientific point of view, as in the organ being a pretty interesting creation, which actually has ancient Greek roots. That was a coincidence, of course. I found out about it later. And of course, one of the first composers that came to mind for me was Bach. And I had a really big obsession with Bach. So some of my favorite Bach pieces were for organ. So that kind of drove me.
Interesting story, right? You discovered that the roots of these instruments come from Greece, from Greek culture, right? The engineer Ctesibios, right?
Ctesibios, exactly. Yes.
Fantastic, and of course we marvel at his hydraulic organ, but you have to imagine that this instrument stood not very far from your house, right? In kilometers, it's very far, of course, in Alexandria somewhere, right? But basically in that region. Right, so yes, it was part of the ingenious invention that Ctesibius did, that this water pumped instrument came into even Western civilization through Roman Empire and Byzantine Empire, and later on Middle Ages, and even into the churches now, and it's centuries, millennium old tradition. And it all comes from Greece.
Yeah, it's quite a, maybe I'm the Greek organ missionary.
Exactly. So, Nicholas, you were fascinated with music of J.S. Bach. By the time you were starting playing the organ, what was the first Bach's piece that you heard on this instrument? Do you know?
The first piece I heard was, it might sound a bit cliche, but it was the Toccata and Fugue in D minor, the well-known one. It was the piece because we had some CDs at home with some organ music somewhere, and those were those CDs that had the typical hits of organ repertoire, amongst others, the famous D minor Toccata and Fugue. So that was the first piece I heard, I think.
Yeah, a lot of people are fascinated by the virtuosic runs, right, and passages with the toccata. What was more fascinating to you, toccata or the fugue, by the way? The dramatic opening and diminished chords of the toccata, or the running violin-like passages in the fugue?
It was indeed the fugue, actually, that fascinated me the most. I actually now just remember, I recall a moment where, since maybe I must have been around 10, and of course, at the time, we didn't have such good internet, so the, let's say, libraries and things like this were not yet available. So I remember that I wanted to buy the transcription of this piece for piano by Busoni. And I remember before that, I was trying to kind of play by ear the organ version, kind of, and find out how it goes. That was quite fun for me, being 9 or 10 years old. And in the end, I got the transcription from Busoni, only to find out that actually it was almost a different piece.
Right. And it's much more difficult to play on the piano, the fugue, right?
It's extremely difficult.
Octaves and very virtuoso runs. You have to be quite advanced in order to play this on piano.
True. And indeed, after I saw the organ score, I was surprised on how much simpler it looked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the feet is just like the third hand, and
Yep.
basically nothing very fancy about it, right? Alternate toes technique, left, right, most of the time. But when you add the bass line to the left hand right passages, it becomes increasingly difficult unless you play with four hands as a piano duet
Yeah,
with
that's true.
somebody,
That's true. Yes.
right? That's also possible, and people have done this in the past. So wonderful. Bach's D minor toccata. What happened next, Nicholas? How did you decided to become a professional at this? Of course, this passion of yours, right? You were fascinated with music of Bach. How did you decide to devote your life to this instrument and to this career?
This is an interesting question indeed, because I think it is a result of, let's say, a natural progression through my life. It wasn't, let's say, one day that I woke up and I decided it. It started making more sense and more sense as I was, let's say, growing. Because, let's say, also during high school, I continued with piano and with organ, and I started getting better at it. And I started thinking, hey, I'm increasingly interested. And of course, at some moment, you get to think, what would I like to do after high school? And both my parents were very supportive in my idea of pursuing it professionally. So, yeah, I think it was a bit of my initiative, but at the same time, the support of the people around me who, let's say, liked the idea and promoted it. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
It's good to have a supportive family, right?
Yes.
Because sometimes it's the opposite. You have the passion, you have the vision and inspiration, even a calling maybe, right, to become an organist, and then your family, your parents are basically from another field, and then they say, no, choose the real profession, like
Yeah.
the lawyer or medicine or business, something, right? But that wasn't the case in your family.
No, I'm very glad it wasn't. It's actually, they were all like completely supporting me. And because also my family is relatively, they come from my mother is an actress
Uh-huh.
and my dad is a sound engineer. So they have worked in other fields of, let's say, in the arts, so to say.
Yes.
So it is in that tradition. So it didn't seem like an outside concept to them. And I'm very glad.
Exactly. They knew the arts from up close, right? Acting is one form of art. Sound engineering and working with music is also another sphere with technology, right? And it's good that your path led to the artistic direction quite smoothly, I say, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, true.
So, of course, you had to choose the school and the teacher, right? How did you decide to study at the let's say in Corfu, right? First, but what was your first university that you studied in in Greece, right?
That was, yes, it was also an interesting story because due to how the system of education works in Greece, once you finish high school, you're
Mm-hmm.
kind of automatically accepted to a certain university you have applied for.
Uh-huh.
So because in Greece, conservatories are not exactly how they are, for instance, in the Netherlands or in France or in other countries. They're a bit of mostly private institutions that are not, they can't offer, let's say, a bachelor diploma or a master's. So the next closest thing is musicology.
Uh-huh.
And there are three departments of musicology, one in Athens, one in Corfu, and one in Thessaloniki. And I was accepted in the one in Corfu. So that was directly after high school. But I did go there. But I must say that, yeah, in the end, it was a pretty vague place. So it wasn't exactly for me. Also in organization wise, but also I didn't really find teachers that fit with me.
Right.
And unfortunately, there were not really organ teachers there either. So I would then focus on piano there. But due to circumstances, I decided to not continue there and just turn my attention to looking something in another country, because I anyway had that in mind to do it sooner or later.
Right.
And then yes, sorry.
Yes. So what happened next? You decided to go to Netherlands, right? To the Netherlands.
Yes, I did quite an extensive research I went to actually in the Netherlands, and I went also to Denmark.
Right.
So I had a bit of a tour with all great teachers, very nice places. And in the end, I did the entrance exam in the conservatory in Amsterdam, and I was accepted. So I was like, yes, fine. Of course, before I had met teachers in many places, and I had ended up that, for me at least, the best solution for me and the nicest was Amsterdam.
Amsterdam, of course, it's the center in this region, probably with a lot of fantastic instruments and fantastic teachers, right? Of course, we are very sorry that Jacques van Ortmersen is no longer with us. But have you met him while studying the organ?
Of course, he was the first teacher I actually met in Amsterdam, and I started to study with him for the first 2 years. And it was the unfortunate moment during my third year that he passed away. But I did have quite a lot of input from him, and I'm extremely appreciative of it.
Right. Well, the Dutch tradition is fantastic because it all focuses on good posture and good habits of organ playing, how to sit down on the organ bench, and how to adapt yourself and your body positions to historical instruments, right? How to play with ease. And of course, it all connects to Genevan psalm traditions, right? 150 psalms. Do you like this collection of psalms?
Yes, for sure. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So have you played them? Have you harmonized? I can suspect, since you are also working in improvisation, that psalms and, let's say, even Lutheran chorales have foundation in your improvisation studies as well, besides continua.
Yes, that's for sure. Psalms and hymns and other things like this have often been material to experiment with and to improvise and to compose.
Mm-hmm.
And they for sure provide a great basis for thematic material.
Right. And what else did you learn from Jacques van Ortmersen?
A lot of things. Well, let me try to think what's the best way to, let's say, Jacques had, let's say, what I really liked in his philosophy, he was a person that said that when you go to a restaurant and you are served a nice dish, you don't care how the chef made it, but you care that it's nice. And it's kind of this tradition that he tried to also portray through giving you the right tools to use the organ and making a nice, aesthetically and musically nice result. And he was a great pedagogue. Yeah, all of his students here, we all remember stories he used to say, and these kind of things continue and will continue. Mm-hmm. And he insisted quite a lot on technique, but I completely understand why a few years later. Because he really focused on giving you the right tools to really express what you want to do without having any problems with you. You can technically play on any instrument you want and you will feel right at home.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, because let's say historical Dutch organs are not the easiest instruments to play, and if you can adapt to those instruments, you can play almost anywhere.
That is true, and that is one of the big advantages. I'm very happy and very glad I have such opportunities to play in such great instruments that are available in the Netherlands in general, because we get some of the most special historical organs from different times, from different famous builders, such as Schnitger, such as Müller, and Bach's organs and Hinz organs. And of course, these are many times quite hard to play, especially if you are not used to their touch and their setting. And yeah, it's quite an achievement to be able to adapt to all of them, but it's definitely worth it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the acoustics in these churches are so fabulous, right? Especially for people from United States or from other side of the Atlantic, where they're used to having almost no echo, no reverberation. And when they come to organ tours to Europe and other parts of Northern Europe and the Netherlands, they are discovered that all those Gothic cathedrals, right, they have tremendous spaces, and you have to play quite differently then.
That is indeed true. And yeah, I must say that most churches here have quite big acoustics. I mean, the big churches have relatively big acoustics. And I had done my final exam in the BAVO in Haarlem. Mm-hmm. And that's quite an instrument to adapt to, especially when it comes to the acoustics. Because what you hear upstairs in the organ gallery is not at all what is sounding downstairs where people sit. So that's a very interesting experience on adapting your playing on every place you go. And yeah.
I met Jacques twice, I think, in Sweden, in Gothenburg Organ Academy back in 2000 and 2002. And yes, I've noticed that he insists on a good technique, but as you say, it has a point, right? Of letting you play with confidence, with ease, with adaptation to the instruments, and not the other way around. You don't force the instrument, but you let it play.
Yes, exactly. And it's all about, in a way, it's all about the ergonomy of organ playing.
Yeah.
Spending the least amount of effort, having the least amount of tension, really being conscious about what you do with the instrument. And then you also are more conscious about how the instrument reacts and how the phrasing is and how the sound is produced. And all these things make a really big impact at the end result.
And Nicholas, of course, this concept of playing with simplicity, minimalistic approach is not new, right? We know stories about Johann Sebastian Bach, how he played and his fingers and feet were almost, stationary. Basically, people around him were marveling how he could play with such an ease, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Play.
And I think that is a bit also what, in general, teachers here try to promote. Not only, of course, it's not only the case of Bach, it's also Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach has written quite a lot about that. And yeah, it's not, let's say, that's why it's not nonsense, so to say. So it's not at all a new thing, but it is also, when one is doing it, it's good to know what the point is. So it doesn't seem like they have to do it for the sake of just doing it. But really, it does have a significant result. And it does take also, of course, time to develop it. It is something that takes patience, adapting to this technique.
And Nicholas, when you met, for example, Peter van Dyck later, was his teaching cardinally different than Jacques, or he was continuing that tradition?
I would say it is quite close. It wasn't like a black and white transition. It was quite similar with small details that are different, but overall the approach focuses on the same aspects.
Mm-hmm. I was lucky to have two podcast conversations with Peter, and one was just recently, a couple of months ago, when he was visiting Vilnius here, and he gave a master class to students from this country, and I had this luck of observing how he teaches, and a lot of things that you said about Jack also resonated with me when Peter played, and his ideas too. Yeah, it's probably the broad Dutch tradition, generally speaking.
Yeah, it might be so indeed. But I must say that it is a tradition that makes sense, and I think that it promotes a certain logic that once you have conquered, so to say, then most organs you are able to play with no problem at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What happens when you go to non-historical organ or in a dead acoustics, like in Walserherk, there is, I think, this organ, beautiful Baroque organ, but the space is not very reverberant, as I remember.
In Walserkerk, yes, it is indeed less reverberant, but I would still not call it extremely dry. It has let's say, a pleasant short acoustic. But the organ is so marvelous in itself that it's not affected at all by that.
Mm-hmm.
So I must say, especially for that organ, for Baroque music, it's not the biggest organ ever. It doesn't have the most stops, but every single stop it has is extremely special.
Right. I remember the demonstration that Jacques gave to the students from all over the world at this Alkmaar Organ Academy. I was also there at that time, and he was the organist at that church, right? So he knew everything inside out.
He knew, if there was one person that knew that organ well, it was probably him and probably Leonard before him. So for sure, he knew how to properly handle it to make the best out of its sound.
Right.
Because at first, it's an organ that doesn't seem particularly difficult to play, but you have so much control over the release of the keys and the touch and this kind of things that the sound is affected a lot by how you play.
Yeah, not every instrument reacts this way to the player, right?
That's true. That is mostly for historical organs that they tend to have this, since let's say the connection is mechanical, then your actions on the keyboard are more translated in a musical way or in a sound way.
But even that, when the action is not very sensitive, then the connection is not that apparent. And in Walserkerk, I think it is very sensitive, right?
It is, yes. Indeed.
Wonderful. So you got the best of both Jacques and Peter. Who are other mentors of yours? What did you learn from the Dutch tradition going forward?
I have, we should of course not forget, I have one more teacher, that is Matthias.
Matthias Havinga.
Havinga, yes. He's also a wonderful teacher. And of course, what I like is that everybody is working together. And it is always nice to have more opinions, and it's always nice to hear new things, even when two teachers disagree, which is where the most interesting things about your own development appear, because then you get to have this input up for yourself and think, because that's also something I've learned, is to use your ears, basically, and ask yourself, do I like this? What would I like? How can I achieve what I like? In the end, it's about getting the right tools and then expressing your own self using those tools.
Right, Nicholas. So, of course, remembering your days back in Corfu, of course, you were interested in music theory, right? And we have not to forget that you are also a composer. How did this music theory background help you shape your career and get interested into creating music?
Since I started with music theory in Greece, I was always very interested in harmony. So that was one of the first subjects that really caught my attention, and the logic it creates, the progressions, harmonic progressions. And I started experimenting with them on the piano, of course. So I was many times already doing things on the piano that at the time I didn't know what they were, theoretically speaking, but when I found out later, I could use them in a better way. And it was one of the points that really started developing my ears on, different kind of sounds, different kind of harmonies, different kind of things. So I must say that experimenting for me on the piano, even before I had the proper theoretical knowledge, was a key in developing my ear in that direction. So yeah, eventually I finished the theory studies in Greece. So at the time I went to Amsterdam, I already had, let's say, a good harmony knowledge and analysis and this kind of stuff. And later I started thinking, because in the meantime, of course, improvisation was kind of there, because since I was experimenting with harmonic progressions and things on the piano, it was a bit a natural thing to occur. And yeah, later I started improvising more. And at some moments I had some pretty nice musical ideas, and then I wrote them down. And later I thought maybe I can make something out of it. Or I liked an improvisation, then I wrote it down and worked on it later. So in that way I took more the composition term. So more out of experience and experimenting, and yeah, basically.
It's very interesting you mentioned experimenting. I think people sometimes shy away from experience and experiments and only play what's written on the page, right? And don't read the written down music as a model for further experiments, right? And what you did, congratulations.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, this is something I believe is in general a bit a result of, let's say, the norms of recent years in classical music in general, not necessarily only organ, but it's more that there seems to be this tendency of people just to play repertoire. And let's say the creative aspect of music making, for instance, improvising, it has kind of faded away as a result of that. And that's a tremendous pity, in my opinion, because I think it's such creative processes that are the most rewarding and fun, in the end, things in music, and also broaden one's horizons in how he listens to things.
Completely true. I think without that, we would be quite shy, and this curiosity will lead us maybe to a known direction, right? Maybe around the corner we will make a meeting with some kind of I don't know, very artistic inspiration that could lead us and propel us forward, right? And we can then later write it down or play it further on the spot. But it's important to stay curious, don't you think?
Yes, I think so. And that's the clue in keeping it fresh also. Because it's when you experiment with something and you know that even if you use the same theme twice, the overall outcome won't be the same. So you have this concept of, let's say, dynamic music generation instead of just playing something that already exists, which of course is fine. But in the creative aspect, it is something that really has an effect, I think.
So when we look at the models of early masters, and sometimes we want to create something of our own, and we see, for example, those beautiful ritornellos, right? Which like they are like interludes or introductions of the for the chorales, choral preludes, and they connect various modulations, right, of choral phrases. And we can use them in our playing as well. But if we try to write down things, we could easily notate as they are written, and they would be rigid, the same way as in the beginning, like second repetition, third repetition, and we would really have to think about changing things and including variation very consciously if we write down. But if we just play things, repetition is almost never a case. We always vary things, right? Because it's so difficult to remember.
Exactly. It happens as a result of our own nature, actually, maybe our own flaws. Maybe if we could remember it exactly, we would do it. But since we can't, it results in an automatic set of variation making.
Yeah. And this vitality, this living organism that musical piece becomes is very fascinating to the listener as well, because they can hear what's going on. Sometimes, oh, I know this theme. Oh, I know this figure. It's from the beginning and other places, but it's not the same. He or she uses it differently every time.
Yeah, that is especially interesting. I
it's
like to think of, yeah.
I was just going to say it's like telling stories, right? In literary forms, we never repeat things twice, right? We say differently. So the same is with musical rhetoric.
I was about to say actually the same thing about storytelling, because that's what
Ah,
improvising is in the end. Yeah. I like to think of it in a way, it's like you're telling a story. And much
mhm.
like when you tell a story, you might know what you're talking about, so you might have an idea. But of course, you can adapt the story, you can say it in a particular way. It might have endings that people didn't expect. It might be this, it might be the other. So, of course, improvisation is a kind of a storytelling through music.
Exactly. When you create your musical pieces, right, Nicholas, do you also think in terms of storytelling or purely in musical theory terms?
It depends. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. For instance, now recently I've been working on writing a composition for piano and voice
Hmm.
based on a poem of a famous Greek poet. So in that sense, I do think of it also as a storytelling, because the poem is so powerful in itself that I try to portray what it says through the music.
Yeah.
For other compositions, I don't necessarily think of, let's say, a particular story literally behind it. So I always find something to do with, so that, for instance, when I write a set of variations, they should have a background story in themselves on why are they the way they are,
Hmm.
but not necessarily in the sense of telling a literal story.
Right. So, talking about creating further, what is your stylistic approach? Do you have a model or several models that you work from, or maybe you are inspired from other masters from the past, or maybe you have already found your own, so to say, style?
Well, I think it's a pretty hard thing for me to actually really say I have found my style. I think that's something that was developing and will never be exactly the same from one moment to the other. But in general, I would say that my composition style in general relies more on music aesthetics than trying to reinvent the wheel, so to say. So my style ends up being a bit like late romantic in general,
Hmm.
late romantic to a bit also modern sometimes. But that's not a result of me trying to copy a composer. It's just a result of what I like. It's very simple, actually. It
Hmm.
is, let's say, my natural tendency of playing things end up in that style. So that's the style I like to work best with, at least for now.
And of course, it might be the case with the instrument at hand. Yes. What kind of organ is in your church? Which is you are the organist at Pilgrimskerk, right?
That is correct. Well, it's
Hmm.
not one of the best or one of the most glorious organs. It's two manual, around 30 stops organ in neo-baroque in style. It is in very good condition and makes a
Hmm.
great instrument also for concert, but also for practicing. Yeah, I don't have one that is comparable to Valsekerk or the Bavo yet,
Hmm.
but that's yet to come.
Yes. So of course, when you have this instrument, you can do a lot of things, right? And uh, I suspect usually creators and organists who want to create something, they have some kind of musical language under their fingers or in their mind that they're capable and comfortable in using. So you say late romantic and chromatic harmony and early modern techniques. If you know this really well, you naturally tend to use it, right?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. So one is the other in a way.
Hmm.
So I have something in mind, then also my fingers know something, so then it's combined, then I play something, then I might write it down and experiment more with it. Yeah, and in the end I get this kind of result that for me it comes naturally. It's not, I'm not forcing myself to make it necessarily sound like this or like something else.
Yeah. Was it always the case with this style, or did you change over time?
I think I did change over time. In the beginning, I was much more Baroque oriented actually in my style.
Mm-hmm.
So I really liked more preludes and fugues and things that really were in the style of Bach, which I still like doing sometimes, just writing a fugue in a Baroque style. But I must say, as I continued developing as an organist, and I also got exposed to more, let's say, composers of the late Romantic era for organ, let's say Max Reger and César Franck, definitely influences in my ideas. Yeah, I started being also captivated by their style.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I remember those early pieces that I wrote also. They were based on the hymn harmonizations and hymn improvisations that I made in the style of let's say Krebs, right? But
Yeah.
I tried to copy the style of Bach, of course, but I wasn't good at enough, so it became Krebs. And I remember sending those manuscripts to the publisher in the United States. I think it was Wayne Leopold, and I got the response that, oh, it's interesting that you're trying to imitate the style, but nobody can really compete with Herr Bach. So that's what, when I understood that I have to look deeper and search for my own language.
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, stylistic writing is one thing, and I think it's perfectly respectable. But of course, yeah, the master already existed. And of course, creating something doesn't necessarily mean that it's competing with him. It can also be just complementing a style, because many people, for instance, like the style but run out of pieces to listen to. So sometimes, yeah, having some fresh material portrayed through the prism of a composer, of course, it will never be the same, and we all know that. But yeah, maybe that's also part of the story.
But what happens here, if we are trying to extend this story, musical style, into other paradigms and try to create something of our own, it's not very bad, because in literary terms, it's called fan fiction. If you like, let's say, a book of certain author, or a story of certain author, let's say Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
And you want to keep going in the Star Wars universe, right? And you create stories of your own based on those characters and those settings, right? And you create and continue those adventures of your own. People actually are going to relate, because there are thousands and even millions of people around the world who are interested in this already.
That's true, indeed. And I don't think that is, in the same way as in composing music, I don't think that is necessarily competing, let's say, with the company that wrote Star Wars in the beginning. You're just extending it in your own way. And of course, whether or not that's a convincing thing to do is up to the people who listen to or see to judge. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah, and other people are writing similar things, and you read similar books, right, based on those fan fiction stories, and you kind of interact. It's a little community. So I guess it's the same with organists who try to improvise, let's say, in the Baroque style, in the Romantic style, in the let's say impressionistic style. They all get something out of it together as a community, right? Interchanging ideas.
Yes, I think so too. And I also think that eventually, on whatever style you start with, slowly you actually are led to your own style. Mm-hmm. So eventually it is the beginning of finding your own style. You can start on the left, you can start on the right, and eventually you get to find also what your own style is.
Yeah, and as you say, it's always changing, right? It's never constant. It's always fluid.
Yeah, I think music is a living form, and the more stimuli one hears and one gets over the years, the more his own perception and style changes. So yes, it's not necessarily, I don't know many composers, especially later, that compose in the same way from the beginning of their lives to the end of their lives.
No, that would be bad.
Sometimes it evolves in weird ways. Sometimes it evolves in ways that you didn't expect. But I think this is a very trivial part, this natural evolution of every composer's style.
So, Nicholas, what is the most challenging thing for you when you compose?
That's a very good question, because I must say that composing in general for me isn't a linear process. Of course, many times I have, let's say, a period of, like say, a week that I can't get any good idea. So it is part, let's say, of the process. It needs also time, and needs also time to think and to have new hearings and not force it. For me, at least, from my experience, whenever I am stuck in something and I try to force it, it doesn't improve. And usually the best ideas come in moments I never expect. Like I start to practice a piece, and at some moment my mind wanders and I start improvising with something. And then I think, this is what I was missing. With composing in general, it's tricky thing is about structure and how to present your ideas in an order that are comprehensible and make sense, so to say, so that they are not lost in the river of, let's say, music. And that's always a tricky thing to find. And of course, it always helps to have a couple of people listen to it and think, what do they think about it? Because sometimes when you compose, you're so much in your own composition world that you can't, your, let's say, perception of the composition changes.
That's right. And of course, on the other hand, it's quite easy to compose something very structurally clear and but at the same time it would be very boring if it's 1 2 3 1 2 3 kind of linear and rhythmically boring way of writing, right? You have to leave some surprise probably.
Well, exactly, and that is with music in general. This is how it works. You have an expectation as a listener, and sometimes this expectation is met. Sometimes this expectation is happily not met. So you get a surprise. You thought it was going somewhere, and it was going somewhere else. And it's this kind of let's say, exceptions that make pieces special and make moments memorable. Creating tension, creating resolution after the tension. It's a balance between all these things.
Right. So what about your playing the organ then? Organ playing now, what is the most challenging thing for you?
For me, the most challenging thing is currently I'm going a bit further in later pieces. So Messiaen, for instance, I haven't had so much experience with Messiaen yet. So I'm exploring his world and also adapting the technical difficulties of Messiaen on the organs we have here, which can be tricky, but in general, it's a pretty pleasant process. And also, of course, digging deeper in the musical meaning of every composer. That's, of course, a process that can go on forever. In a way, I wouldn't say I find it difficult, but it's definitely challenging.
So if you want to play Messiaen on the Dutch instruments, right, sometimes, how can you adapt things? What do you do sometimes?
Most likely the first thing that you will encounter on these organs is that you don't have enough keys. So many times you have to play things an octave lower with using 4-foot pitches, for instance, so that it actually sounds at the right pitch. Second is that many of these pieces were written for organs with a very soft touch or with a Barker machine, much like French organs. And then when you have to play with manual couples and these kind of things, it can become quite challenging. So it is about further, let's say, developing your technique so that you can still, and of course it is possible once you have gone through 4 years of studying here, but still, of course, it remains a challenge to adapt this to really difficult pieces that require legato and octaves and big chords. And in the end, there are solutions. So it is doable. It's not impossible.
Excuse me. Of course, when we play mechanical instruments, sometimes playing with mechanical couplers is really tricky. But sometimes it's not even necessary if the sound available is so rich and there are many stops to choose from, right? If it's a big.
In general, when we play romantic music that requires a lot of sound, but at the same time is technically difficult, we try not to make our life even more difficult by adding too many couplers. Usually with one coupler, it's actually fine. it's when you add two couplers that things get really serious. And usually we do have enough choices on one manual by itself to make, let's say, a convincing result of what we want. And then we, let's say, carefully and strategically place which passages will be played with a coupler, which ones not. And above all, staying in close contact with the keys and being relaxed.
Exactly. So you have to think very wisely about how to make sense of all those registrational choices that composer wrote, perhaps in French instruments, and you have to adapt on your situation, right? Let's say a person is in another country, not only in the Dutch tradition, but let's say in the Danish tradition, right? Or the Spanish tradition, or in America, or Australia, English tradition, let's say. They all have different things, but I think the most important thing is still to communicate the story behind the music, right?
And that is exactly what's the most important thing indeed. It is about translating the music into something that is, I mean, you use an organ. Of course, sometimes you might not have precisely the stops a composer asks, but of course that is not the point. The point is to transmit the message the composer wants. And of course, many times you need to also improvise in how you're going to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to be very wise. Of course, what helps is that you know your piece inside out, right? You analyze probably not only in terms of modulations and chords and modes used and rhythms in terms of Messiaen, but also on a deeper level, you know, what is behind those religious cycles that he wrote, right? How he worked and how you can transfer this message to your listener in a new situation, on the new instrument.
Yes, of course. And with Messiaen especially, that is especially true because usually many of his compositions have such a background, a religious background about something. And then each, let's say, composition includes that somehow in it. And it's your challenge to somehow translate this, A, into the music and B, into the sound.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we are getting close to wrapping up our wonderful conversation, and it's been really inspiring to listen to you. And I hope people will get so much out of this and get their try their things on paper and experiment with musical ideas on the instrument as you did. But before we close, Nicholas, could you mention 3 steps that an organist should take in order to get better?
Let me think. 3 steps for somebody to get better.
Yeah, as an organist, to become a better organist, let's say.
Okay, in the first place, I would say patience is very important. So people shouldn't necessarily expect to have quick results and magic potions and secret recipes. It is more about, being patient. Second of all is getting a good technique.
Mm-hmm.
And that will really help you get out of all the things that might have been stopping you from playing things. And of course that takes time, but it also makes a really big difference in the final result. And as a last, I would say use your ears.
Mm-hmm. Good one. You know, I ask this question almost every guest, and each person, each organist has a totally different answer, right? And but they are all good answers. There are no wrong answers here, right?
True. Of course, I mean, everybody has their own opinions, but in the end, we all agree. We all have common grounds.
Yes. In the end, all those things lead to the mastery of the instrument and to the better storytelling as a performer.
Yes, indeed.
Wonderful. So, Nicholas, we are I'm very glad we have met, and I hope we meet again in perhaps even in person. But before we end this conversation, could you give our listeners a link where they can find you and your work online?
Of course, I would urge them to visit my personal website. That is www.nicholaspapadimitriou.com. Nicholas written with a CH. There they can find my upcoming concerts, my compositions, my biography, videos, and more.
Wonderful. I'll make sure to include this link in the description of this conversation, and people can literally click and visit you online and support and say hello and basically motivate you to create even further.
Well, I hope.
Have a great evening in Amsterdam. Will you be practicing tonight?
Tonight I will be having, let's see, now it's 5. I'll be having a rehearsal with the choir. I'm replacing somebody at 7:30. And I think until then I will go practice a bit for what I have to do in the rehearsal.
Me too. I'm also going to run to practice some buxtehude.
Nice.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. You've been wonderful and very inspiring guest. Thank you so much. Keep creating and keep sharing your music with the world.
I will continue. I will do my best. And it was an honor being interviewed.
If you liked this conversation, I encourage you to visit my blog Secrets of Organ Playing at organduo.lt, where you will find lots of insights, practical advice and training for every area of organ playing. You can subscribe to this blog for free to get your daily dose of inspiration and to be the first to know when any of my future podcasts roll out. I hope to help you reach your dreams in organ playing. I'm Philippos Nakas. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you online really soon.